Everyone thought Emma Rose was easy to manage. 70 years old, soft voice, slow steps, always asking before speaking like he still needed permission in her own house. After her husband passed, her son Daniel insisted she move in for her own good. He said it in front of relatives, neighbors, church friends. Everyone nodded. It sounded responsible. It sounded loving. It wasn't. At first, Emma Rose believed him. She sold her small apartment, packed only what she needed, and moved into Daniel's house with her daughter-in-law Linda and their 2 kids. She took the smallest room, didn't complain, didn't interfere. She cooked when asked, stayed quiet when ignored, and smiled when decisions were made without her. She told herself this was family. This was adjustment. Then small things started disappearing. Her mail opened by mistake, her pension redirected for convenience, her room rearranged without asking. When she questioned it, Daniel sighed like she was exhausting. Linda smiled tightly and said, "You worrying too much." They spoke over her, around her, past her like she was furniture that still breathed. The day Emma Rose asked about her bank statements, Daniel's tone changed. Not loud, just firm. "I handle the finances now," he said. "It's easier this way." He said it like a favor, like authority, like ownership. Emma Rose nodded and said nothing, but something inside her clicked into place. She had raised this man. She recognized that voice. Control always pretends to be care. That night, Emma Rose sat on the edge of her bed and thought about the years she spent saving quietly, planning carefully, trusting slowly. She thought about her husband's habit of writing everything down. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook she'd carried for years empty, waiting. She wrote one line, "Family doesn't mean surrender." She closed the notebook gently and turned off the light. They thought she had given up her life. What they didn't know was she had just started paying attention. The next few weeks passed the way storms usually do, quiet before anyone notices the air has changed. Emma Rose adjusted her routines carefully. She woke earlier. She listened more than she spoke. She let Daniel believe he was in charge. Let Linda believe she was winning something invisible. Power loves comfort. It loosens its grip when it thinks it's secure. Emma Rose began to notice patterns. Bills discussed in low voices. Decisions made when she wasn't in the room. Her pension mentioned like household income, not hers. When relatives called, Daniel answered for her. When friends visited, Linda hovered close, steering conversations away from money, away from independence. Emma Rose smiled through it all, playing the role they had written for her. One afternoon, she asked Linda casually where the old documents were, the ones from her late husband. Linda waved it off. Daniel put them somewhere safe. Safe meant hidden. Hidden meant controlled. Emma Rose nodded and let it go. She had learned long ago that asking twice only warned people. That evening, Daniel brought her tea and spoke gently, like you speak to someone fragile. "You don't need to worry about paperwork anymore," he said. "We'll take care of everything." Emma Rose thanked him, hands steady, eyes soft. Inside, she counted dates, changes, words that didn't match actions. After dinner, when the house grew loud with television and phone screens, Emma Rose slipped into the small storage room. Boxes stacked high, labeled carelessly. She moved slowly, respectfully, like she wasn't trespassing in her own life. It took time, but patience had never failed her before. She found copies of documents, bank letters, a folder with her name written by someone else's hand. She didn't take anything. She didn't rearrange. She memorized. Back in her room, she opened the notebook again and added another line. Control grows where silence is mistaken for weakness. She closed it, tucked it away, and lay down calmly. They thought she depended on them now. They didn't realize she was learning how far they'd gone. And once you know that, you know exactly where to begin. The line was crossed on a Sunday, the kind meant for family lunches and polite smiles. Relatives filled the living room, laughter loud enough to cover tension. Emma Rose sat in her usual chair, hands folded, listening while Daniel talked about future planning. He spoke confidently, explaining how he had simplified things by consolidating accounts, how it was safer this way, smarter. Heads nodded. Linda added comments about responsibility and care, her voice sweet, rehearsed. Then Daniel said it clear and final. We've updated the will to avoid confusion later. He didn't look at Emma Rose when he said it. He didn't have to. The room felt suddenly smaller. Emma Rose smiled faintly, the way she always did, but inside something hardened. They hadn't just taken control. They had erased her consent and replaced it with convenience. After the guests left, Emma Rose asked quietly where the new documents were kept. Daniel sighed, irritated now, and said it wasn't something she needed to worry about. Linda stood behind him, arms crossed, nodding like this was already settled. Emma Rose nodded too, stepped back, and returned to her room without another word. That night, sleep didn't come easily, not because she was upset, but because clarity has a way of waking you up. She thought about every sacrifice she'd made, every decision she delayed so her children could stand taller. She thought about how control often wears the mask of love, and how dangerous that mask can be. Before dawn, she dressed quietly and packed a small bag, nothing dramatic, just essentials. She left a note on the table thanking them for breakfast and saying she'd be back later. She wasn't lying, she just hadn't said when. Outside, the morning air felt sharp and honest. Emma Rose walked to the bus stop with steady steps and a clear plan forming in her mind. She wasn't running away, she was repositioning. Because forgiveness is one thing, but permission is another, and they had taken that without asking. And once that happens, silence stops being kindness and starts being strategy. Emma Rose didn't go far, but she went somewhere deliberate. She rode the bus across town to a small community office she'd visited years ago, back when her husband was still alive and paperwork was handled face to face. The building smelled the same old files, weak coffee, patience. She waited her turn without rushing, watching people argue loudly about problems they didn't fully understand. When her name was called, she spoke softly and clearly, asking for information, not permission. She requested copies of her financial records, confirmations of recent changes, explanations of authorizations. The woman across the desk looked up more than once, surprised by how prepared Emma Rose already was. Nothing had been done illegally, not yet, but too much had been done for her without her signature. That mattered. Emma Rose listened carefully as options were laid out, timelines explained, safeguards mentioned. She didn't commit to anything on the spot. She thanked them, collected the documents, and asked one final question about independent access. The answer settled something in her chest. On the way back, she stopped at a quiet cafe and sat by the window, reviewing papers slowly, letting the shape of the situation become clear. This wasn't theft yet. This was pressure, misdirection, assumed consent. The kind that grows bold if left alone. When she returned to Daniel's house that evening, no one questioned where she'd been. That told her everything. They were comfortable again. They believed she'd cooled off. Linda mentioned dinner plans. Daniel asked if she was tired. Emma Rose smiled. thanked them, and went to her room. That night, she opened her notebook and wrote carefully, her handwriting steady. They believe comfort equals control. She placed the new documents beneath the mattress, not hidden, just private. For the first time since moving in, Emma Rose felt balanced, not angry, not afraid, ready. Because the most effective moves are made when everyone else thinks the moment has passed. And now she knew exactly who needed to hear her voice next and who didn't. Emma Rose didn't confront Daniel or Linda. Confrontation would have warned them, and warnings only make people hide their tracks better. Instead, she made calls, not many, just the right ones. An old family lawyer her husband once trusted. A bank officer who still remembered her name because she had always asked careful questions. A distant cousin who worked in social services and understood how easily care could cross into control. Emma Rose didn't accuse anyone. She didn't dramatize. She asked questions the way she always had: calm, respectful, precise. Each conversation added another layer of clarity. She learned what could be reversed, what required proof, and what depended entirely on timing. Back at the house, Daniel grew more relaxed, mistaking her quiet for acceptance. Linda began talking openly about long-term arrangements, about downsizing Emma Rose's belongings, about what was practical at her age. Emma Rose listened and nodded, committing every word to memory. One evening, Daniel casually mentioned signing paperwork on her behalf to speed things up. He said it like a joke. Emma Rose smiled and excused herself early. In her room, she wrote again in the notebook, slower this time. They are moving faster. She understood now that speed was their weakness. People rush when they think the finish line is close. A few days later, she requested her pension statements directly, had them sent to a separate address, and opened a new account in her own name quietly, legally, without announcement. Nothing dramatic changed in the house, but the balance had shifted. Control had started slipping out of hands that didn't realize they were losing it. Emma Rose slept better that night, not because the problem was solved, but because it was finally contained. She wasn't planning revenge fueled by anger. She was preparing correction fueled by certainty. And certainty, she knew, always arrives before consequences. Daniel sensed the shift before he understood it. It showed up in small things: an account balance that didn't look the way he expected, a notification that arrived later than usual, a form that now required Emma Rose's direct approval. Nothing was broken, nothing was missing, but something was no longer moving as easily as it had. He asked casually, masking it as concern, whether she'd changed anything at the bank. Emma Rose looked up from her tea and said no more than necessary. I asked some questions, she replied. Daniel laughed it off, telling himself it was harmless, but his jaw tightened just a bit. Linda noticed too. She began hovering again, offering help that sounded like supervision, suggesting appointments, reminding Emma Rose of schedules she'd never forgotten before. Emma Rose accepted the attention with grace, thanked them both, and continued exactly as planned. Behind closed doors, she organized her documents, matched signatures, highlighted dates. She wasn't undoing anything yet. She was letting the trail grow clear enough that it couldn't be denied. One evening, Daniel snapped without meaning to, accusing her of mistrust. The word hung there, heavy and unfair. Emma Rose met his eyes calmly and said, trust doesn't disappear suddenly. It erodes. He didn't respond. He didn't know how. That night, Linda searched through drawers when she thought Emma Rose was asleep, looking for papers that were no longer there. Emma Rose heard the movement, counted the steps, and stayed still. Panic always comes after entitlement realizes it isn't alone anymore. By morning, Daniel had scheduled a family discussion, the kind meant to reassert control under the cover of concern. Emma Rose agreed to it immediately. She even suggested a time. Because now she wasn't avoiding the conversation. She was choosing the moment. And when people choose the moment, it's usually because they already know how the story ends. The family meeting was set for after dinner, when plates were cleared and the house felt falsely calm. Daniel sat at the head of the table, posture stiff, already rehearsing his points. Linda positioned herself beside him, arms folded, eyes alert. Emma Rose took her usual seat, back straight, hands resting lightly on the table, her face unreadable. Daniel started first, talking about stress, responsibility, how things had gotten complicated. He spoke like a manager, not a son, explaining why decisions had been made without her, why it was easier this way, why questioning them only created problems. Linda added her part, softer but sharper, suggesting Emma Rose was confused, overwhelmed, better off not dealing with details. They spoke for a long time. No one asked Emma Rose anything. When they finally paused, expecting agreement, Emma Rose didn't rush to answer. She waited until the silence grew uncomfortable, until both of them leaned forward slightly, ready to interrupt. Then she spoke. Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't shake. She thanked them for their concern, acknowledged their efforts, and then calmly corrected them one point at a time. She named the accounts that required her signature. She referenced the dates changes were made. She mentioned the lawyer she'd consulted, the bank officer she'd spoken to, the copies she now held. The room changed immediately. Daniel's face tightened. Linda's confidence faltered. Emma Rose continued, not accusing, just clarifying. She explained what could be reversed easily and what would require formal explanation. She finished by saying she would be managing her own affairs again, effective immediately, and that cooperation would make things simple. Resistance would make things documented, no threats, no anger, just outcomes. Daniel tried to regain control, raising his voice slightly, insisting they were family. Emma Rose looked at him steadily and replied, "That's exactly why this needed to stop." Linda said nothing. She couldn't. The power in the room had shifted to cleanly. When Emma Rose stood to leave the table, Daniel realized something too late. This meeting hadn't been about discussion. It had been about notice, and once notice is given calmly and completely, there's nothing left to argue. After the meeting, the house didn't explode into chaos the way Daniel had expected. There were no slammed doors, no shouting matches, no dramatic ultimatums. That unsettled him more than anger would have. Linda busied herself with dishes that were already clean, moving things around without purpose, her mind racing faster than her hands. Daniel retreated to his office, pretending to answer emails while replaying Emma Rose's words again and again, trying to find a weakness in them. There wasn't one. Everything she had said was calm, factual, and already backed by action. Over the next few days, they tried to adjust quietly. Linda became overly polite, asking before entering Emma Rose's room, offering help that now sounded forced. Daniel attempted casual conversations, testing whether authority could be rebuilt through familiarity. Emma Rose responded kindly but firmly, keeping her routines unchanged. She made her own calls, checked her own mail, and locked her door at night without explanation. The shift unsettled them. Control is comfortable only when it's invisible. Once named, it becomes fragile. One afternoon, Daniel discovered that a transfer he had expected to go through had been blocked pending Emma Rose's confirmation. He stared at the screen longer than necessary, then closed the laptop without saying a word. That evening, Linda whispered that maybe they had pushed too far. Daniel snapped back that it was under control, but his voice lacked conviction. Emma Rose noticed everything. She also noticed what they didn't do. They didn't challenge her directly. They didn't threaten. They didn't escalate. Fear had replaced confidence, and fear makes people hesitate. That hesitation gave Emma Rose exactly what she needed: time. She spent it carefully, finalizing changes, setting boundaries in writing, ensuring that nothing could quietly revert back once attention faded. She wasn't trying to punish them. She was removing the conditions that had allowed them to believe they could take. And as the house grew quieter, heavier with unspoken tension, Emma Rose felt something settle inside her, a steady certainty that whatever came next, she would no longer be managed in her own life. The first consequence didn't announce itself at home. It arrived through a phone call Daniel wasn't expecting. His bank requested clarification on recent authorizations, routine review, they said. Nothing urgent, but the tone told him otherwise. Questions were being asked that didn't have easy answers. He hung up slowly, the house suddenly feeling smaller than it had that morning. Linda noticed immediately, asking what was wrong. Daniel waved it off, but his mind was already racing, tracing backward to every shortcut he'd taken under the assumption of consent. Emma Rose watched the tension build without commenting, noticing how Daniel now stepped outside to take calls, how Linda's confidence dissolved into nervous planning. A letter followed 2 days later, formal and polite, requesting documentation related to financial management and beneficiary changes. It wasn't an accusation. It was worse. It was process. Emma Rose read the copy that arrived for her records and folded it neatly and surprised. Systems move slowly, but once they start, they don't stop for emotions. Daniel tried to reframe the situation that evening, suggesting they all sit down again as a family, this time softer, almost pleading. Emma Rose declined without hostility. "There's nothing left to discuss," she said. "Everything is already clear." Linda's eyes flicked toward the door, toward the future she hadn't planned for. Over the next week, Daniel's confidence eroded further as more confirmations were required, more signatures, requested signatures he could no longer provide. What had once felt like quiet control now felt like exposure. Emma Rose continued her days calmly, leaving the house when she pleased, returning without explanation, her independence no longer theoretical. The balance had tipped, not because she demanded it, but because she documented it. And Daniel began to understand the truth too late. What happens inside a family doesn't stay there when it crosses into records, timelines, and paper trails. Once that line is crossed, love stops being a shield and accountability steps in. Daniel stopped sleeping properly. It showed in the way he snapped at small things, in the dark circles under his eyes, in how often he checked his phone like it might betray him if left alone. The requests for clarification had turned into deadlines, and deadlines have a way of exposing how little control you actually have. Linda tried to stay optimistic, suggesting lawyers, suggesting explanations, suggesting that Emma Rose would eventually come around. Emma Rose heard all of it and said nothing. She didn't need to convince them anymore. The system was already listening. One afternoon, a representative requested a meeting with Emma Rose present. Daniel insisted on joining, but the invitation made it clear whose voice mattered now. The room was quiet, professional, neutral. Questions were asked calmly, answers were expected to match documents. When Daniel spoke, he sounded defensive without realizing it. When Emma Rose spoke, she sounded prepared. She didn't accuse her son. She described events, dates, decisions made without her consent, actions taken for convenience. The language was gentle, but the meaning was firm. Linda tried to soften the edges, framing everything as misunderstanding. But misunderstandings don't usually come with patterns. By the end of the meeting, next steps were outlined clearly: temporary restrictions, independent review, follow-up timelines. Daniel nodded along, but his hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. On the way home, no one spoke. The house that once felt like Daniel's domain now felt borrowed, unstable, unfamiliar. Emma Rose returned to her room, closed the door, and sat quietly, breathing evenly. She felt no satisfaction, no triumph. Just a deep sense of alignment. She hadn't broken her family. She had stopped herself from disappearing inside it. And sometimes, that's the most difficult boundary to draw, especially when the people crossing it once held your hand. The review period stretched on longer than Daniel expected, and that uncertainty gnawed at him more than any accusation could have. Silence from institutions is never empty. It's busy doing its work. Linda grew restless, alternating between reassurance and blame, sometimes apologizing to Emma Rose in a voice that sounded more strategic than sincere, other times snapping at Daniel for letting things get this far. Emma Rose accepted the apologies politely and ignored the arguments completely. She had learned that once people start arguing among themselves, the balance has already shifted. Letters arrived requesting additional clarification, each one narrowing the space Daniel had to maneuver. Restrictions became firmer, temporary became extended. Emma Rose was informed directly, with respect, with options. Daniel was copied. That detail alone changed everything. One evening, Daniel tried again to appeal to emotion, standing in Emma Rose's doorway, reminding her of sacrifices he'd made, of years he'd taken care of her. Emma Rose listened patiently, then replied without heat. Care that requires silence is not care. The words landed heavier than shouting ever could. Daniel had no answer. He stepped back, suddenly unsure where authority had gone. Linda watched from the hallway, fear now fully visible, realizing that control built quietly could be dismantled just as quietly. Emma Rose returned to her chair by the window that night and watched the streetlights come on, feeling something close to peace. Not because the situation was over, but because it was no longer hidden. The hardest part was done. Once truth is placed in the open, it doesn't need defending. It simply waits for the world to catch up. The decision arrived without ceremony, which somehow made it heavier. A formal notice outlining corrective steps, oversight measures, and a clear return of control to Emma Rose, no blame assigned. No accusations written down, just outcomes that could not be reversed quietly. Daniel read the letter twice before handing it to Linda, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and resignation. Linda scanned it quickly, then more slowly, as if reading it again might soften its meaning. It didn't. That evening, dinner was silent. No one mentioned the notice, but it sat on the counter like an uninvited guest everyone was pretending not to see. Emma Rose ate calmly, thanked Linda for the meal, and excused herself early. In her room, she placed the notice with her other documents, aligning the edges carefully. She felt a strange relief, not joy, not vindication, relief that she no longer had to prove anything. The proof now existed independently of her. Over the next days, adjustments were made. Access changed, notifications redirected, permissions clarified. Daniel moved through the house like someone learning a new map, unsure which doors were still his to open. Linda oscillated between politeness and quiet resentment, but she stopped crossing into Emma Rose's space. That alone felt significant. One afternoon, Daniel asked if Emma Rose planned to stay. The question wasn't hostile, it was uncertain. Emma Rose looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I'll decide that myself," she said gently. The words weren't sharp, but they cut 3 years of assumption. Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. For the first time since she'd moved in, Emma Rose felt fully present in her own life again. Not managed, not overseen, just standing exactly where she belonged. And once someone reaches that point, every choice afterward becomes theirs alone. With control returned, the house felt unfamiliar in a different way. The air was lighter, but also honest, stripped of the false calm that had once masked quiet domination. Emma Rose noticed how. Daniel now asked instead of assumed how Linda hesitated before entering her room, how every interaction carried a careful distance that hadn't existed before. Respect, she realized, often looks like restraint. The days passed without incident, but inside Daniel something continued to unravel. He had built his authority on certainty, on the belief that he knew what was best, and now that belief had been formally challenged. At work, he found himself distracted, replaying conversations, second-guessing decisions, aware for the first time that systems did not bend simply because you were confident. Linda, on the other hand, grew quieter, her energy turning inward as she recalculated her place in a house where Emma Rose was no longer passive. One evening, Linda offered tea and apologized again, this time without excuses, without explanation. Emma Rose accepted the cup and thanked her, neither forgiving nor rejecting, simply allowing the moment to exist. Forgiveness, she knew, was personal. Boundaries were permanent. That night, Emma Rose slept deeply, the kind of sleep that comes when vigilance is no longer required. She understood now that the most difficult phase of reclaiming oneself wasn't the confrontation, it was living afterward without shrinking again to make others comfortable. And she promised herself she wouldn't. Whatever choice came next, whether she stayed or left, it would be made without pressure, without fear, without permission. Because once you reclaim your voice, even silence becomes something you choose and not something imposed. The question of leaving began to surface in small, almost invisible ways. Emma Rose found herself noticing things she had once ignored: the lack of sunlight in her room, the way conversations stopped when she entered, the careful politeness that replaced warmth. Control had ended, but closeness hadn't returned. She didn't resent that. Some distances are necessary after truth settles. Daniel tried to act normal, suggesting outings, offering help, speaking with a gentleness that felt new and uncertain. Linda kept busy, reorganizing cabinets that didn't need reorganizing, as if order might restore something that had shifted permanently. Emma Rose listened, observed, and said very little. She had learned that clarity doesn't rush decisions. One afternoon, she took a long walk alone, something she hadn't done since moving in. The air felt different when no one was tracking her time. She sat on a bench and imagined her days shaped only by her own needs: quiet mornings, chosen company, space that didn't carry history's weight. The thought didn't scare her, it steadied her. When she returned home, Daniel asked where she'd been, then corrected himself and said, "I hope you had a nice walk." The change was small, but it mattered. That evening, Emma Rose opened her notebook for the first time in weeks, not to document wrongdoing, but to write one simple question: what do I want now? She closed it without answering. Some questions need time to breathe. And Emma Rose knew this one would shape the rest of her life, not in anger or reaction, but in quiet intention. The answer didn't come suddenly. It arrived in pieces, spread across ordinary days. Emma Rose noticed how peaceful she felt when the house was empty, how her shoulders tightened when voices returned. She watched Daniel move through rooms that no longer bent around him, saw Linda pause before speaking, measuring her words. Nothing was wrong, exactly, but nothing was right either. Safety had been restored, not harmony. One morning, a letter arrived addressed only to Emma Rose, offering a small senior apartment not far away, quiet and affordable, the kind meant for people who wanted independence without isolation. She read it once and set it aside, not trusting the pull she felt toward it just yet. Later that day, Linda asked her opinion on dinner plans and waited for the answer. That waiting mattered more than the question. Emma Rose replied kindly and realized something else had shifted. She no longer felt obligated to smooth the room. That evening, Daniel mentioned future plans, careful not to assume she was included. Emma Rose listened and felt no sting. Inclusion that comes from choice feels different from inclusion that comes from obligation. Before bed, she stood by the window and imagined waking up somewhere that belonged only to her, where silence wasn't strategic but restful. The idea didn't feel like escape. It felt like completion. Emma Rose understood then that reclaiming control was only the first step. The second was deciding what to do with it. And for the first time in a long while, she felt no pressure to decide quickly because whatever she chose next would finally be hers. Emma Rose didn't announce her decision when it finally formed. She didn't owe it drama, and she didn't owe anyone reassurance. She began by doing practical things, sorting clothes she no longer wore, setting aside books she wanted to keep close, discarding items that belonged to a version of her life that had already ended. Daniel noticed the small changes first, drawers opening and closing, boxes appearing in corners, Emma Rose moving with purpose instead of habit. He asked once, carefully, if she was planning something. Emma Rose smiled and said she was planning peace. Linda overheard and went quiet, the meaning landing heavier than an argument ever could. Over the next days, Emma Rose finalized arrangements quietly, signing papers with steady hands, choosing a move-in date that felt right rather than rushed. She informed Daniel and Linda only after everything was confirmed. No negotiation, no discussion. Daniel reacted with shock masked as concern, asking why she couldn't just stay now that things were better. Emma Rose looked at him with a softness that carried no guilt and said, "Better isn't the same as free." Linda said nothing, but her eyes told a story of understanding mixed with loss. On the night before the move, the house felt suspended, like it was holding its breath. Emma Rose slept calmly, waking before dawn to pack the last of her things. She left a note on the kitchen table, not an explanation, just gratitude for the good moments and a reminder that love works best without control. When she closed the door behind her, she didn't feel anger or sadness. She felt alignment. She wasn't leaving to punish anyone. She was leaving because her life no longer fit inside someone else's rules. And once you learn that difference, you never confuse care with control again. The new apartment was smaller, but it breathed differently. Sunlight reached the floor in the mornings without asking permission, and silence there felt like rest instead of strategy. Emma Rose unpacked slowly, placing things where they felt right rather than where they were supposed to go. She noticed how her body moved differently in this space, less guarded, more deliberate. Daniel called on the second day, then again a few days later, his voice careful, unsure where the lines were now. Emma Rose answered kindly but briefly, no longer filling gaps with reassurance. Linda sent a message saying she hoped Emma Rose was settling in. Emma Rose replied with a simple thank you. Distance, she realized, was not punishment, it was calibration. Weeks passed, and routines formed that belonged only to her walks without explanations, meals chosen for taste instead of timing, conversations entered and exited by choice. One afternoon, a letter arrived forwarded from Daniel's address, an official request seeking clarification on earlier authorizations that had been undone. It wasn't accusatory, it was procedural. Rose read it calmly, then filed it where it belonged. The consequences she had set in motion were still unfolding, not loudly, not cruelly, just steadily. She didn't interfere. She didn't gloat. She understood that accountability takes time to settle into bones. That evening, she sat by her window and watched the lights come on across the street, feeling something close to gratitude not for what had happened, but for what no longer could. Because once you step into a life built on your own terms, the past loses its leverage. And that, Rose knew, was the quietest kind of freedom. Time did what it always does when left alone. It revealed things. Daniel's calls became less frequent, then more formal, then cautious again as letters turned into meetings and meetings turned into explanations he wasn't fully prepared to give. Rose wasn't asked to defend herself anymore. She was asked to confirm facts she had already documented. Each confirmation tightened the story into something solid and unavoidable. Linda's messages stopped altogether. Not out of anger, out of awareness. Silence had shifted sides. Rose spent her days simply discovering how much space existed in a life without negotiation. She joined a small reading group, learned the rhythms of the neighborhood, and found comfort in being known only for who she was now, not for what she provided. One afternoon, Daniel showed up unannounced at her door, standing there uncertain, holding a folder like a shield. He spoke slowly, admitting mistakes without fully naming them, asking if there was any way to ease things. Rose invited him in, listened without interruption, and then said something that ended the conversation gently but completely. "What's happening now isn't in my hands anymore." The relief on his face was mixed with fear, because surrendering control doesn't feel like safety, it feels like exposure. After he left, Rose made tea and sat quietly, feeling no satisfaction, no regret. Just distance settling where pressure once lived. She understood now that the true turning point hadn't been documents or meetings or letters. It had been the moment she stopped absorbing responsibility for other people's choices. Once that happened, everything else followed naturally. And as the evening light softened the room, Rose realized that the story was no longer about what had been taken from her, it was about what she had finally stopped giving away. The situation reached its final shape without drama. Daniel stopped calling altogether, not out of anger, but because there was nothing left to negotiate. The reviews concluded, decisions recorded, responsibilities reassigned where they belonged. Consequences didn't crash down, they settled in permanent, official, and impossible to reverse quietly. Rose was informed in writing, thanked for her cooperation, assured no further action was required from her. She read the letter once, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer she rarely opened anymore. Life continued with a softness she had once thought impossible. Mornings stretched without urgency, afternoons filled with small choices that felt surprisingly powerful: what to cook, where to walk, whom to call. One evening, she received a message from a distant relative saying, "I heard what you did." "I didn't know you were that strong." Rose smiled at the screen and didn't reply. Strength didn't need explanation. Later that night, she sat by the window, watching the streets settle into quiet, and understood something fully at last. The story hadn't ended with revenge. it had ended with balance. No shouting, no punishment, no public victory, just the steady return of her life to her own hands. And as the lights dimmed across the buildings, Emma Rose felt no need to look back. Everything that needed correcting had been corrected. Everything that needed protecting was now safe, and that, she knew, was enough. With the noise gone, Emma Rose discovered something unexpected. Space invites reflection. Not the painful kind, but the honest kind that asks who you are when no one is watching you manage a situation anymore. She spent afternoons rearranging nothing in particular, sometimes just sitting with a book open on her lap, not reading, letting time move at its own pace. The absence of tension felt unfamiliar at first, like a room after furniture has been moved out. Daniel crossed her mind occasionally, not with anger, not even disappointment, but with a distant understanding. She saw now how easily love slips into entitlement when people stop checking themselves. One morning, she received a small envelope from her bank confirming her accounts were fully independent and permanently secured. The words were simple, but they carried weight. She placed the letter beside her tea and smiled quietly. Later that day, she helped a neighbor fill out a form, explaining gently why signatures matter and why questions should always be written down. The neighbor thanked her like she'd been given a secret. Emma Rose realized then that her story hadn't ended in isolation. It had widened, not as a warning, but as an example. That night, she lay in bed listening to the soft hum of the building, feeling something settle deep inside her chest, not relief, not pride, ownership, because when a woman reclaims her life without shouting, without bitterness, without cruelty, she doesn't just end a chapter, she changes how the next one will be written. And Emma Rose was finally ready to write it slowly, on her own terms. The legacy showed itself in ways Emma Rose hadn't planned for. A call from her reading group turned into a longer conversation about independence, then into quiet questions asked after meetings ended. Someone mentioned a sister living with relatives who handled her money for convenience. Another spoke about an aunt whose opinions were slowly being replaced by decisions made on her behalf. Emma Rose listened more than she spoke, but when she did speak, she kept it simple. Keep copies, ask for explanations in writing, never confuse love with permission. She didn't tell her story. She didn't need to. The guidance traveled on its own. At home, her days continued gently. She cooked when she felt like it, skipped meals when she didn't. She walked without checking the time. She slept without bracing for the next conversation. One afternoon, Daniel sent a short message saying he hoped she was well. No questions, no requests, just a line, careful and distant. Emma Rose read it and set the phone down without replying. Silence, she had learned, could be kind when it was chosen. That evening, she sat by the window and watched a young couple argue softly in the street below, then laugh and walk on together. Life didn't resolve into perfect endings. It resolved into patterns, healthier ones, if you were willing to interrupt the old. Emma Rose felt no need to supervise that process anymore. Her role wasn't to fix families. It was to remind people that dignity survives only when it's defended early and quietly. And as night settled in, she felt certain of one thing. What she had reclaimed could not be taken again, because it no longer depended on anyone else's understanding. The invitation came folded inside an envelope left at her door, handwritten, careful, respectful. A community center nearby was starting a small discussion group for seniors. Nothing formal, nothing loud, just a space to talk about boundaries, finances, and independence. Someone had mentioned Emma Rose's name, not as a warning, but as reassurance. She considered declining influence, once tasted, can quietly turn into obligation. But this felt different. It felt optional. She attended the first meeting without announcing herself, sitting near the back, listening as stories unfolded that sounded to familiar children who meant well, spouses who decided unilaterally, relatives who confused help with control. Emma Rose spoke only once, near the end, and what she said was brief. If someone makes decisions for you without asking, write it down. If they get angry when you ask why, write that down too. The room went still, not heavy, but focused. Afterward, a few people thanked her quietly, the way people do when something important has been named without being dramatized. Walking home, Emma Rose felt a gentle satisfaction not because she'd helped, but because she hadn't overextended herself. She wasn't carrying anyone else's story. She was offering a method and letting go. Back in her apartment, she made tea and sat in the fading light, aware that this phase of her life was no longer about reaction or correction. It was about presence, being where she chose to be. Speaking when it mattered, resting when it didn't, and for the first time in a long while, Emma Rose felt certain that nothing ahead would require her to shrink again just to keep the peace. Closure didn't arrive as a moment, it arrived as a feeling that stopped asking for validation. Emma Rose noticed it one morning while watering the small plant by her window, realizing she hadn't thought about Daniel or Linda in days. Not because she was avoiding the memory, but because it no longer carried weight. The past had softened into information instead of emotion. Later that week, a neighbor knocked to return a borrowed book and stayed to talk longer than expected. They spoke about ordinary things, weather, recipes, aches that come and go, and when the conversation ended, Emma Rose felt content rather than drained. That distinction mattered. It told her she was no longer performing calm, she was living it. A letter arrived confirming everything was finalized, archived, closed. She read it once and recycled it. Proof had served its purpose. That afternoon, she walked farther than usual, sat on a bench she'd never noticed before, and watched people move through their lives with urgency she no longer shared. She understood then that what she'd reclaimed wasn't just control, it was time. Time not spent managing others' expectations. Time not spent defending her right to exist as herself. As evening fell, Emma Rose returned home and turned on a lamp, the light warm and steady. Nothing waited for her attention. Nothing demanded explanation. The quiet felt complete, like a chapter that had ended not with a period, but with space. The echo returned when Emma Rose least expected it, not as a problem, but as a reminder. A woman from the community group called one afternoon, voice hesitant, explaining a situation that sounded painfully familiar: an adult child managing things temporarily, documents being signed for convenience, questions answered with irritation instead of clarity. Emma Rose listened without interrupting, without reacting, letting the story reveal its own shape. When the woman finished, Emma Rose didn't offer comfort first. She offered direction. Write everything down. Ask for copies. Speak once clearly, and then stop explaining yourself. The woman thanked her like she'd been given permission to stand up straight. After the call ended, Emma Rose sat quietly for a while, realizing how far she had come. Once she had needed guidance. Now she was simply pointing to the path and stepping aside. That evening, Daniel's name appeared briefly on her phone screen. An accidental call quickly ended. Emma Rose didn't return it, not out of resentment, but because there was nothing left to resolve. She had moved beyond reaction. The past no longer had access to her time. She prepared dinner slowly, ate without distraction, and washed the dishes while the sky darkened outside. The rhythm felt complete. Some stories don't close with forgiveness or confrontation. They close when attention shifts elsewhere, when the mind stops circling old wounds and begins to rest in the present. Rose understood now that peace wasn't something you earn at the end of conflict. It was something you choose again and again. Once you stop giving your power away, peace settled in layers, not all at once. Rose noticed it in the way mornings no longer carried anticipation or dread, just possibility. She woke when her body was ready, not when someone else's schedule demanded it. She moved through her apartment without explaining herself to anyone, without adjusting her presence to fit another person's comfort. One afternoon, she found the old notebook tucked at the back of a drawer, its pages filled with careful handwriting from a time when attention had been armor. She flipped through it slowly, not reliving the moments, just acknowledging them. Each line marked a step she had taken toward herself. She closed the notebook and didn't put it back. Some tools are meant to be retired once their work is done. That evening, she sat by the window as rain softened the streetlights, feeling no urge to reach out, no need to check in, no pull toward old dynamics. Daniel and Linda existed somewhere beyond her daily life now, not as threats or regrets, just as people who had taught her something difficult and necessary. Rose realized then that revenge had never been the point. Restoration had. She hadn't taken anything from them. She had taken herself back. And as the rain eased into silence, she felt a calm certainty settle in her chest, the kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand recognition, but stays. Because when a woman quietly reclaims her life, she doesn't need closure from anyone else. The story closes itself. What came next surprised even Rose, not conflict, not drama, but clarity without effort. Days passed where nothing tested her boundaries, and that absence revealed how much energy she had once spent simply staying steady. She began noticing her own preferences again, small ones she had buried for years. How she liked her tea stronger than she admitted, how silence felt better in the afternoon than conversation, how she enjoyed choosing not to explain herself. One morning, she received a forwarded document by mistake, an internal family email that mentioned her in passing, framed as handled and resolved. Rose read it once and felt no sting. Being reduced no longer threatened her. She understood now that people who minimize others often do it to manage their own discomfort. She deleted the message and went for a walk. Outside, the world moved without reference to her past. Children ran, buses passed, people argued and reconciled in minutes. She sat on a bench and realized that her life had expanded not because she gained something new, but because she stopped orbiting old expectations. That afternoon, she donated the old notebook to a shredder at the community center, watching the pages disappear without ceremony. She didn't feel loss. She felt release. Memory no longer needed proof. As evening came, Rose returned home and cooked a meal she liked, just for herself, without adjusting flavors for anyone else. She ate slowly, fully present. Some victories are invisible to others. They don't announce themselves. They simply change how you breathe. And Rose was breathing freely now, knowing the hardest part of her journey was behind her, not the struggle, but the decision to never return to who she had been before it. The distance grew comfortable, then familiar, then permanent in the best way. Rose noticed how her name no longer came with a role attached to it, no expectations, no obligations, no silent negotiations trailing behind it. She was simply herself again. One afternoon, she received a short handwritten note slipped under her door from a neighbor she barely knew. Thanking her for listening during a difficult week, Emma Rose smiled at the simplicity of it. Listening, she had learned, was powerful only when it wasn't followed by control. That evening, she thought briefly about Daniel, not with sadness, not with blame, but with the understanding that some relationships change shape when respect is restored too late. She accepted that truth without resentment. The world outside her window moved steadily, indifferent to past struggles, and that indifference felt freeing. Emma Rose brewed her tea, sat in her favorite chair, and realized something quietly profound. She no longer replayed conversations in her head. No corrections, no imagined responses. The mental noise had gone. When life stops demanding explanations, peace doesn't feel dramatic, it feels ordinary. And that ordinariness, she knew, was the most honest reward of all. The season changed without asking her permission, and Emma Rose welcomed it the way she welcomed everything now, without resistance. Cooler mornings arrived, carrying the kind of air that sharpens the mind and steadies the body. She found herself enjoying routines again, not as obligations but as anchors. A walk at the same hour, tea at the same table. Silence that felt chosen. One afternoon, she ran into a distant relative at the market, someone who hadn't seen her since the early days of the arrangement. The woman commented on how calm Emma Rose looked, how settled. Emma Rose thanked her and changed the subject, because explanations felt unnecessary now. Later, as she carried her groceries home, she realized something subtle had shifted inside her. She no longer measured her life against what it had been before. Comparison had faded. What mattered was alignment. That evening, she sorted through old photos, not searching for loss, but acknowledging continuity. She had been strong then, too just quieter about it. The strength hadn't arrived late, it had simply been tested later. As night settled in, Emma Rose turned off the lights and sat in the dark for a moment, listening to the steady hum of the building. Nothing demanded her attention. Nothing waited to be fixed. And in that stillness, she understood that the story was nearing its natural end, not because something dramatic had happened, but because nothing else needed to. The ending approached the way healing often does, so gently that it almost went unnoticed. Emma Rose realized it one evening while folding laundry, aware that her mind was completely still. No scanning for problems, no revisiting old moments. Just hands moving, breath steady, thoughts unburdened. She paused and let that feeling settle, recognizing it for what it was, completion. Daniel and Linda existed now as facts, not forces. Their choices had taken their own shape, separate from her life, and that separation felt clean. She didn't wish them harm. She didn't wish them closeness either. Balance had been restored, and balance didn't ask for emotional commentary. A neighbor stopped by to ask about a recipe, and they laughed briefly over something unimportant. Emma Rose noticed how easily laughter came now, how it didn't carry tension or relief, just presence. That night, she sat by the window one last time, watching lights flicker on and off across the street, thinking about how quietly her life had turned itself back toward her. She hadn't needed permission. She hadn't needed approval. She had needed attention, patience, and the courage to stop absorbing what wasn't hers to carry. As she turned off the lamp and prepared for sleep, Emma Rose felt certain of one thing. Whatever stories others told about her, the truth lived in her peace. And that peace wasn't fragile. It was earned. The story ended without an announcement, the way real endings usually do. Emma Rose woke one morning and felt no urge to mark the day as different, yet everything about it was. She moved through her apartment slowly, deliberately, aware of her own presence in each step. There was no weight in her chest, no unfinished thought tugging at her attention. The past had settled into its proper place behind her, quiet, no longer reaching forward. She made her tea, stood by the window, and watched the city begin another ordinary day, knowing she would move through it on her own terms. Daniel and Linda were no longer lessons she revisited. They were chapters already read and closed. What remained was not revenge, not bitterness, not even forgiveness, but ownership. Of her time, of her choices, of her silence. Emma Rose understood now that the most powerful thing she had done was not exposing control or reclaiming what was taken. It was refusing to disappear quietly for the comfort of others. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't broken her family. She had simply stepped back into herself and stayed there. And as the light filled the room, steady and calm, Emma Rose smiled not because she had won, but because she was free. That was the payback. Years later, no one in Emma Rose's building knew the full story, and that suited her just fine. To them, she was simply the woman who walked every morning at the same hour, who greeted people with calm eyes and never seemed rushed by anything. They didn't know she had once been managed, redirected, slowly erased inside the word family. They didn't know how carefully she had learned to listen, to document, to wait. What they saw was the result, not the struggle, a woman comfortable in her own silence, unbothered by opinions, uninterested in control. Sometimes, when younger women spoke to her about family tensions, about being made to feel small for the sake of peace, Emma Rose would listen without judgment and say very little. Just enough to remind them that love does not require surrender and care does not cancel consent. Then she would let the conversation end on its own, never chasing impact. Because she understood something deeply now. The strongest lessons don't come from speeches. They come from presence, from watching someone live without apology, from realizing that quiet does not mean weak, and patience does not mean powerless. Emma Rose never called what she did revenge. She called it returning to herself. And in the end, that was the only ending she had ever wanted. Emma Rose's life did not grow louder after everything ended. It grew steadier. Days unfolded without explanation, without adjustment, without the old habit of bracing herself for someone else's expectations. She no longer needed to prove strength because strength was no longer questioned. Family became a word with distance built into it, not bitterness, just boundaries held firm and respected. When she thought back on everything that had happened, she felt no anger toward Daniel or Linda, only clarity. They had taken what her silence allowed, and she had taken back what mattered by choosing not to disappear anymore. Emma Rose understood now that revenge doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like walking away with your dignity intact. Sometimes it looks like peace that cannot be negotiated away. She lived the rest of her days exactly as she wished, calm, independent, unclaimed. And in that quiet freedom, the story found its true ending. She hadn't broken anyone. She had simply refused to be broken. That was the payback. If this story stayed with you, it's because quiet strength always does. Like the video if you believe respect should never come with control. Subscribe to Payback Files Stories for more family revenge stories where silence speaks louder than words. And comment below, was Emma Rose right to walk away? Because here at Payback Files, every story ends with payback, and the calm ones always win.